Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the Triton ball python. The Triton actually consists of 4 genes: the pastel, the fire, the orange dream, and the Enchi. It's a really bright and flashy combination. Essentially what it is, it's a firefly with the pastel and the fire, and then when you add orange dream on top of a firefly, you make an even brighter combination, and then you layer Enchi on top of that, and you reduce the pattern and make it even brighter. It's pretty amazing. And kind of the coolest part about the Triton is if you actually breed it to something else, you can reproduce the parent because all the genes are co-dominant. It's pretty awesome. So I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you the potential of the Triton ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and I want to start with the 4 genes that make up the Triton. And essentially what I want to do is I want to start with the pastel and then add 1 gene at a time to the pastel so you can really see the effect of every gene worked into the mix. And this is what a pastel looks like. The pastel essentially is a yellow snake. It's actually a co-dominant gene. So if you breed it to something else, half the offspring come out as pastel. And the pastels can be pretty variable. Some of them can be super bright yellow. I've actually produced some really super bright pastels that are just blindingly bright, and I've actually produced some that are pretty browned out too. And usually with pastels, a lot of times they'll actually brown out as they age and mature, kind of get like a reddish brown color. And the pastels are usually, you have kind of a pattern reduction in the pastels, and this one I'd say is probably not as reduced as I've seen a lot of them. You can almost see the little alien heads on this pastel. Sometimes you can get pastels that are almost reduced like into tiger stripes. It's really variable from one to the other. So this is the pastel. If you actually add fire to the pastel, it really enhances the combination. Take a look at this. This is what a fire looks like. And I say the fire is kind of tricky because if you look at it just as a standalone morph, you wouldn't really think that it would brighten and enhance a lot of combinations. And essentially what it does is the fire really kind of lightens the background. A lot of times it'll clean up the pattern and kind of reduce a lot of pixelation and combinations. And kind of the one thing about the fire, it's a little bit tricky to work with because it's actually in the black-eyed leucistic complex. So if you breed a fire to another fire, you get an all-white snake with black eyes. So if you're actually working the Triton into something else and you hit the super fire, it can kind of put a kink in your plans because essentially the all-white snake will completely mask all the other genes. So if you actually take the fire and you breed it to the pastel, this is what you get. You get a firefly, which by itself is a pretty bright snake. I've actually seen some fireflies that some of them are really super bright and some of them, they're really not that bright. I think it really depends on the line of pastel that you work into the firefly. And I'd say usually the fireflies are a lot brighter than just the standalone version of the pastel. The fire really enhances the brightness of the yellow, and a lot of times it'll really clean it up. It's pretty amazing. And kind of the cool thing I like about the firefly is it really keeps the color of the snake really bright as it ages and matures, kind of opposite of what you'd get usually in a pastel. Although I have seen some pastels that are really bright as adults, but I'd say it's kind of unusual. So here is the Enchi, another component of the Triton. And essentially what the Enchi does is it really reduces the pattern. You can see in this example, it almost brings it down into tiger stripes on the side of the snake. And it's kind of interesting. When I first started looking at Enchi a couple years ago, I always thought that the Enchi was mainly just a pattern reducing gene. Come to find out, the Enchi really increases a lot of the brightness and usually a lot of the orange color when you mix it into a lot of combinations. So here's what happens if you take Enchi and you work it into a firefly. Take a look at this crazy snake. That is pretty amazing. I absolutely love working Enchi into a lot of combinations, especially when you work it into the bright genes. That is a pretty amazing combination. And usually these aren't really that expensive either. Take a look at the price on this one. This one's only $225. Not too bad for a really super bright 3 gene combinations. And essentially the price is pretty low because all these genes have been around for quite a long time: the fire, the pastel, and the Enchi. So we can actually take that last snake and go one step further, make it even brighter by adding Orange Dream. And this is what Orange Dream is. And Orange Dream is kind of variable too. I'd say even more variable than the pastel. There's a whole bunch of different lines. There's actually a really super bright Orange Dream line a lot of people label as the high intensity line of Orange Dream. And sometimes it'll command a higher price, sometimes 10 times as much as like the lower versions of the Orange Dream. And just looking at this Orange Dream, I'd say this is a really high intensity. You know, if you're actually getting a lot of this bright, almost like a metallic, kind of a gold color, like this coppery color, that is usually the high intensity line of the Orange Dream. And the Orange Dream can kind of trick you too, because sometimes the pattern's reduced almost as much as an Enchi, and a lot of times on the belly of an Orange Dream, a lot of times it'll have tracks on either side of the belly that almost look like het pied markers, which is kind of interesting. So here's what happens if you take Orange Dream and you work it into the Enchi Firefly. Take a look at this. This is the Triton. That is a crazy looking snake. That's probably one of the brightest snakes you can get. As a matter of fact, you can actually go one step brighter by adding some more genes. I'm going to show you how to do that. But if you actually just look at the snake, this is a pretty amazing combination. The Orange Dream, the Fire, the Pastel, and the Enchi. I was kind of curious. I didn't even look at how much this one was. This one sold for $700. Actually, it's still for sale. Pretty amazing combination. And sometimes I can guarantee that the picture, it even states it down here in the comments. It says, pictures do not do this boy justice. Sometimes you can't really even capture the beauty of a ball python like this until you actually pick it up and hold it in your hand. Sometimes you just can't capture it on camera. And I can guarantee this one is super bright with a high contrast. Pretty amazing combination. So here is the yellow belly, and yellow belly works really well with all these genes. As a matter of fact, all these genes are pretty much all the brightest genes you can get working together in unison. It's kind of interesting. Yellow belly is a standalone gene. It almost looks like a normal ball python. It's kind of one of the sleeper morphs that if you kind of look at it by itself, it doesn't look like much at all, but when you mix it into other combinations, essentially it brings out a lot of the brightness and a lot of the oranges in a lot of cases. And I'd say pretty much more yellow in a lot of combinations with the pastel and the fire. You can really brighten and enhance them. And the yellow belly does have a few clues as far as kind of picking it out from a normal. You can actually see on some yellow bellies it actually has a little bit of flaming, like this light color coming up between the pattern. And sometimes on the yellow belly it'll have kind of a lighter head, although I've seen kind of this on some normals too. But kind of the telltale sign for yellow belly is if you flip it over and look at the belly, usually it has some checkering on the belly, which pretty much indicates that it's a yellow belly. Sometimes they're kind of hard to pick out from a normal. So if you actually take the yellow belly and work it into the Triton, take a look what you get. You get this crazy looking snake, probably one of the brightest snakes I've ever seen over here on Morphmarket. This thing is just glowing, pretty amazing. This is the Orange Dream, Pastel, Yellow Belly, Enchi, Fire. Pretty much all the brightest genes that you can get in one snake. And I was kind of looking at this price too. This was $900. As a matter of fact, this one would be, you know, a good one to add to my collection if I was in the market for a really awesome snake working on the bright projects. And a lot of people sometimes actually go kind of to the dark side and work on the dark morphs, and this is like completely opposite, working on the brighter genes. Sometimes you can go either way, and sometimes if you mix them, you don't really get that good of results. And it's kind of interesting. It's almost like painting a canvas. You can get a whole variety of different paint jobs on the ball pythons. So take a look at this one. This is actually, essentially what this is the Triton with one more copy of the Pastel. So this could be considered like a super Triton, I guess you could call it, or a killer Triton, which would be another name you can call it. So this is essentially the Orange Dream Enchi Superfly, which is essentially exactly the same. The Orange Dream Enchi, Fire, and Pastel is the Triton, all those four genes. Then you add one more copy of Pastel, and it kind of gives you this interesting effect. A lot of times when you have two copies of Pastel, a lot of times it'll kind of reduce the contrast of the snake, so you really don't get the high contrast. But a lot of times with another copy of Pastel, you actually increase the brightness of the yellow, which is pretty awesome. And a lot of times with the Super Pastel, you get a really super washed out head. That's a pretty amazing combination. So here is another thing you kind of have to watch out for if you're actually working on this project and you're breeding the Triton to something else. This is the vanilla, and the interesting thing about the vanilla is that it's actually allelic with fire, and you get the vanilla cream, which is really visually dominant. And if you actually take a look at this snake, the vanilla pretty much is a standalone morph, looks almost exactly like the fire. And this one's actually listed as a sulfur / vanilla. And the sulfur, essentially what the sulfur is it's another line of fire, pretty much exactly the same thing as the fire, although I have seen some differences in sulfurs. If you actually make the super sulfur, which is an all-white snake, a lot of times the super sulfurs will have a lot more yellow on the back of the snake versus the super fire. So I think it's a version of the fire, but I think there are definite differences between the sulfur and the fire. But if you actually take the Triton and you breed it to the vanilla, take a look at this. This is a crazy looking snake. This is the Vanilla Scream Enchi Possible Orange Dream. I'd say there's probably Orange Dream in there just because of how bright it is. And sometimes you make a lot of combinations like this and you really can't tell, you know, which genes are in the mix because there's so many of them in there making a really bright snake. So essentially what you're making here, if you actually take a look at the genes on this one, you're looking at the vanilla and the fire, which is the vanilla cream, which is a really visually dominant combination. And that's where all this crazy looking pattern is coming from. And a lot of times the vanilla creams kind of fade out the snake a little bit, so you can definitely see kind of a fading of the high contrast. And then if you take the vanilla fire, the vanilla cream, and then you add pastel to the mix, you get the vanilla scream. That's where the vanilla scream comes from. And then you add the Enchi, which kind of reduces the pattern. You really can't tell a whole lot that the Enchi's in there, maybe bringing out a little more brightness, and then the orange dream in the mix. Pretty amazing combination. So take a look at this. This is another combination you could get. If you actually took the Triton and you bred it to a fire, you could actually get a super fire. And I thought this was kind of interesting. This is essentially what this is. This is a super fire Triton with leopard in the mix. And the kind of the interesting thing is this has a really strong orange band right down the top of the snake. I've never really seen any super fire that had this much color on it, which is kind of interesting. It almost looks like maybe it's the sulfur version of the fire or something. It's a really interesting combination. So essentially this looks exactly like your super fires, and it's masking all the other genes. So this is possible leopard, possible orange dream, possible Enchi, possible pastel. It's pretty much hiding all the other genes, and the only way you can figure out what genes are in this combination is to breed it to something else and prove it out and kind of figure out what you get as far as the offspring breeding it to something else. And a lot of times you can actually pick these up for relatively inexpensive. So this one has all these genes in it, and this one is like 500 bucks. So if you can actually see all these genes in here, and let me tell you, it'd be definitely worth more than $500. And sometimes you can pick up some really good deals, kind of gambling on the genes in here. As a matter of fact, you could actually get this, it'd be really expensive. You could actually spend 500 bucks and end up with a super fire, which they usually don't sell, you know, for $500. And you're kind of gambling on all those different genes in the combination. So here's the last one I wanted to show you. This is a Pinstripe, one of my favorite standalone genes. The Pinstripe is pretty much the most gold snake that you can get. It's almost a metallic gold in some of the hatchlings. Pretty amazing. And the Pinstripes can really hold their gold color as adults. And usually with the Pinstripe you get this really strong stripe right down the top with these kind of little pinstripes right down the side and kind of squished together alien heads. It's a really awesome gene. And the Pinstripe is a co-dominant gene. You breed it to something else, half the offspring come out as Pinstripe, and usually the Pinstripe is really not considered a brightening gene. So this is kind of interesting, working Pinstripe into the mix, because it's not, you know, generally if you're working something like Pinstripe into something else, usually you get almost, sometimes you get like a metallic looking combination, or you get a gold snake. So here's what happens if you work the Pinstripe into the Triton. Take a look at this crazy snake. This is probably the brightest Pinstripe that you can get working all the other genes into the Pinstripe. You can see it's not quite as bright as some of the other combinations because the Pinstripe's not really that bright of a gene, but it's a pretty amazing combination. And you can actually see this really strong stripe right down the top of the back from the Pinstripe, and then usually the Enchi really reduces the Pinstripe pattern into these little kind of blobs right down the, I've seen a lot of the Enchi Pinstripes with this pattern right down the side, so you can definitely see the Enchi in there. And then the yellow belly really brightens it, and the fire brightens it and really cleans up the sides, and the orange dream really brightens and enhances it. Pretty amazing combination. Alright, so it is time for the question of the day. And He Network asks, if I have two juvenile ball pythons, can I keep them in the same enclosure, grow them up together, and will they eventually breed? And that is a very good question. So I'd say most people that are breeding and keeping ball pythons consider them to be solitary animals, and most people would recommend just keeping one animal per enclosure. Although I have heard stories, there's quite a few stories, it seems like I hear more and more, where people keep two juvenile ball pythons together, a male and a female, and they grow up together, and a lot of times they'll like breed every single year and lay eggs, which is pretty surprising. But you know, I'd say probably the exception to the rule is keeping two snakes together as juveniles and growing them up together. I'd say in most cases when you pair up ball pythons or any other snake, probably the most difficult part is a lot of times they'll go on a long breeding fast. As a matter of fact, when I first started in snakes in general, I actually kind of started running out of room, and I picked up these two Arizona mountain king snakes. Really beautiful. It was like a black and red banded snake. Pretty awesome snakes. There's black and red and white. Pretty amazing. And I actually had two of them, a male and a female. I thought, all right, I'm running out of room. I'm going to put them both in this glass enclosure. And they were so awesome, you know, crawling around on the driftwood, and they put their heads on each other and hang out all the time. It was so cute. And then I found out later on that both of them kind of went into breeding mode, and they got skinnier and skinnier and absolutely would not eat. And it was a couple months later where they were getting almost like really scary skinny. It really kind of freaked me out. And at that point I separated them and learned about, you know, the fasting and everything associated with breeding. And you really shouldn't pair up your males and females unless both of them are in really good condition and kind of withstand that fast going into the breeding season. But I'd say there are some exceptions, and I've heard quite a few people, maybe, you know, 4 or 5 different people starting out with 2 juvenile ball pythons, growing them up successfully, and actually having them breed every year, which is pretty amazing. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.